Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.
The impact of the French and Haitian revolutions. On January 2, 1893, the aging Fredrick Douglass delivered an eloquent speech dedicating the Haitian Pavilion at the Chicago World's Fair, or Columbian Exposition. As a recent United States minister and consul general to Haiti, and as an exposition commissioner of the Haitian government, Douglass had helped to plan the exhibits of the pavilion, which he called, following the Puritan John Winthrop, and from the New Testament, Matthew 5:14, a city set upon a hill. If few white Americans associated Haiti with a beacon of hope and salvation, it was a stroke of brilliance for the world's most famous former slave to reverse popular imagery regarding a famous part of the islands Columbus had discovered 4 centuries earlier. After discrediting the common stereotype that Haitians were lazy barbarians who devoted their time to voodoo and child sacrifice, Douglass looked back on the previous century of slave emancipation. Born a slave himself in 1818, he had won international fame as an abolitionist orator and writer, and had become the most prominent black spokesman and statesman in the New World. Speaking, as he said, for the Negro, Douglass had no difficulty in identifying the central event in the entire history of emancipation. We should not forget that the freedom you and I enjoy today, that the freedom that 800,000 colored people enjoy in the British West Indies, the freedom that has come to the colored race the world over, is largely due to the brave stand taken by the black sons of Haiti 90 years ago. When they struck for freedom, they struck for the freedom of every black man in the world. Douglass acknowledged that blacks owed much to the American and British abolitionists, and to the anti-slavery societies in various countries of the world. But, he said, we owe incomparably more to Haiti than to them all, for Haiti was the original pioneer emancipator of the 19th century. It had been Haiti's mission to teach the world the dangers of slavery and the latent powers and capabilities of the black race. After the former slaves of Saint-Domingue had defeated 50,000 of Napoleon's veteran troops and had established their own independent nation, the white world could never be the same. Until Haiti spoke, Douglass pointed out, no Christian nation had abolished Negro slavery. Until she spoke, the slave trade was sanctioned by all the Christian nations of the world, and our land of liberty and light included. Until Haiti spoke, the church was silent, and the pulpit dumb. Douglass knew that history was more complex than that. He knew that if whites had seen Haiti as a very hell of horrors, whose very name was pronounced with a shudder, as he noted at the beginning of his speech, the revolution had inevitably had contradictory effects. As an abolitionist from the time he first began reading William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator, soon after escaping from slavery, Douglass had hardly mentioned the Haitian Revolution in his public speeches, debates, and interviews. For numerous whites, the Haitian Revolution reinforced the conviction that emancipation in any form would lead to economic ruin, and to the indiscriminate massacre of white populations. But Douglass's address of 1893 contained a profound truth. The Haitian Revolution was indeed a turning point in history. Like the Hiroshima bomb, its meaning could be rationalized or repressed, but never really forgotten, since it demonstrated the possible fate of every slaveholding society in the New World. The Haitian Revolution impinged in one way or another on the entire emancipation debate from the British parliamentary move in 1792 to outlaw the African slave trade, to Brazil's final abolition of slavery 96 years later. Like the Exodus narrative in the Bible, the Haitian Revolution showed blacks that liberation was a possibility in historical time. Their condition was not an inescapable fate. In the 1780s, the French colony of Saint-Domingue, the western third of Hispaniola, or Santo Domingo, was the centerpiece of the Atlantic slave system. It produced over half the world's coffee, mainly on smaller slave plantations in the south, owned by free-colored farmers, or lighter-skinned gens de couleur. White planters owned and controlled the much larger sugar plantations in the North Province, and in 1787, Saint-Domingue exported almost as much sugar as Jamaica, Cuba, and Brazil combined. Then the French Revolution ignited a massive slave insurrection and civil war, which from 1791 to 1804 destroyed this highly exploitive pearl of the Antilles. The slaves and free descendants of slaves defeated not only their masters, but the most formidable armies of Spain, Britain, and France. As Douglass put it, Haiti's freedom was not given as a boon, but conquered as a right. Her people fought for it, they suffered for it, and thousands of them endured the most horrible tortures and perished for it. Whereas the American Revolution had been led by what Douglass termed the ruling race of the world, who had the knowledge and character naturally inherited from long years of personal and political freedom, the Haitian rebels represented a race that stood before the world as the most abject, helpless, and degraded of mankind. This heroic achievement evoked little applause from whites, even those who rejoiced over European and Latin American movements of national liberation. Two notable exceptions deserve mention. When the Revolution began, Abraham Bishop and Theodore Dwight were both young recent graduates of Yale College. But Bishop was a Jeffersonian Republican, while Dwight was a conservative Federalist and brother of the more famous Timothy Dwight, who later became president of Yale. As it happened, both Bishop and Theodore Dwight affirmed that the black slaves of Saint-Domingue were fighting for the same cause and principles that Americans had fought for in their own revolution. Both men urged Americans to aid the black rebels. But President Washington's administration was so convinced that the Black Revolution threatened vital American interests that it advanced the white colonists $726,000 for the purchase of arms, munitions, and supplies. In general, the Haitian Revolution reinforced the conviction of slaveholders especially that slave emancipation in any form would lead to economic disaster as well as the slaughter of whites. The waves of fear traveled even faster than the thousands of Dominican refugees who streamed westward to Cuba and Jamaica and northward to Spanish Louisiana and the port cities and towns of the United States. Throughout the Americas, planters and government officials learned in the 1790s to live in a state of alert. The very word Santo Domingo, which English speakers used to refer to the doomed French colony Saint-Domingue, evoked at least a moment of alarm and terror in the minds of slaveholders throughout the hemisphere. Sometimes this example of self-liberation was dismissed as the freakish result of French legislative and military blunders exacerbated by the subversive ideology of abolitionism and the tropical diseases that decimated British and French armies. Abolitionists, both contemporary and in later decades, vacillated between a policy of ignoring the explosive subject of Haiti and warning that insurrections and racial war would be inevitable unless the slaves were peacefully emancipated and converted into grateful free peasants. Whether the Haitian Revolution hastened or delayed the numerous emancipations of the following century, imagery of the great upheaval hovered over the anti-slavery debates like a blood-stained ghost. No internet was required to distribute the British West Indian Brian Edwards's unforgettable descriptions of a white infant impaled on a stake, of white women being repeatedly raped on the corpses of their husbands and fathers, or of the fate of Madame Séjourné. This unfortunate woman, my hand trembles while I write, was far advanced in her pregnancy. The monsters, whose prisoner she was, having first murdered her husband in her presence, ripped her up alive, and threw the infant to the hogs. They then, how shall I relate it, sewed up the head of her murdered husband in Such are thy triumphs, philanthropy. Similar imagery moved back and forth from the printed page to oral traditions, and both French and English publications made repeated use of animal imagery. When once aroused, blacks were savage, tiger-like men, or ferocious beasts, gorged with blood. In human life, though, fear seldom overcomes greed. Planters in Cuba, Brazil, Jamaica, Trinidad, and South Carolina clamored for more African slaves who could help make up the deficit in the world's production of sugar and coffee left by the devastation of Saint-Domingue. The destruction of slavery in Saint-Domingue gave an immense stimulus to plantation slavery from neighboring Cuba and the British West Indies to far-off Brazil. Moreover, as we just briefly noted, in December 1803, just after the disease-ridden French army had finally capitulated to Jean-Jacques Dessalines' former slaves, South Carolina reopened the slave trade and in the next 4 years imported some 38,000 Africans. As Charleston's merchants well knew, the defeat of Napoleon's New World ambitions had opened the way for the Louisiana Purchase. This momentous event, combined with the productivity of the new cotton gin, ensured that American slavery could expand westward without foreign interference. Nevertheless, even Cuba, South Carolina, and other slave-importing regions sought to exclude bondsmen from those colonies in which blacks had been exposed to revolutionary ideas, such as Saint-Domingue, Guadeloupe, and Martinique. Although slave insurrections had usually been associated with a labor force containing a high proportion of recently imported Africans, white leaders now became far more fearful of blacks who had been contaminated by French or abolitionist conceptions of liberty. Yet many of the French refugees who escaped from Saint-Domingue took at least some household slaves with them. In Britain and the United States, abolitionists argued that slavery itself was the obvious cause of slave revolts. Early in 1792, the British abolitionist leader, Thomas Clarkson, insisted that while the French Revolution had presented the slaves with an opportunity to vindicate their humanity, the insurrection in Saint-Domingue could be attributed only to the brutal slave trade and the oppressive system it produced. Far from being an argument against Britain's petitions against the slave trade, Clarkson contended, the events in Saint-Domingue showed that it was sheer madness for the British to continue transporting Africans, who, having the passions of men, would sooner or later avenge their wrongs. Such reasoning was clearly influential in the United States, where planters could rely on a rapid natural increase in the slave population, and where opposition to further slave importation had won sanction from the War of Independence. The nation as a whole was outraged and alarmed by South Carolina's reopening of the slave trade in 1803. The Haitian Revolution thus strengthened the political argument for pressing Congress to outlaw the American slave trade in 1807, the earliest date allowed by the Constitution. The Haitian example, reinforced in 1800 and 1802 by major slave conspiracies in Virginia, also led to laws restricting manumission and nourished interest in deporting free blacks to some distant colony. But what led in the first place to the conflagration in Saint-Domingue? For many decades, the colony had seemed far more stable than neighboring Jamaica. With respect to the French Revolution, it is a fairly self-evident principle that when a nation is absorbed with a major domestic crisis, especially a crisis that explodes into revolution, little attention will be given to foreign policy or the management of distant colonies. As the French Estates General gave way to the Constituent Assembly in the spring of 1789, domestic issues inevitably pushed colonial affairs to the extreme margins of concern. Nevertheless, responsible leaders could hardly forget that the French government, whose bankruptcy ignited the revolutionary crisis, drew crucial revenue from its slave colonies. In addition, millions of French jobs, especially in port cities like Bordeaux, depended on the Atlantic slave trade and the stability of the slave system. Saint-Domingue alone, with some 465,000 slaves by 1789, accounted for about 40% of the total value of France's foreign trade, and was responsible for the livelihood of many thousands of French workers. Finally, as tensions and conflicts arose between colonial governments and the metropolis, some leaders feared that France, having lost Canada in 1763, might find that its far richer Caribbean colonies would follow the example of the British colonies immediately south of Canada and secede. These basic economic and political realities help to explain why, despite all the radical rhetoric and radical actions in France, the Constituent Assembly, in power from the spring of 1789 to September 30th, 1791, refused to consider petitions against the slave trade submitted by the Abolitionist Society, the Société des Amis des Noirs. By the same token, the French slave trade continued to receive an official subsidy until 1793, That is, even after the abolition of the monarchy and the execution of Louis XVI, and 2 years after the start of the massive slave insurrection in Saint-Domingue. From the outset, French colonial issues were complicated by the contested status of free blacks and gens de couleur. The freed population included some people of pure African descent, like Toussaint Louverture. In Saint-Domingue, the number of these free coloreds approximated the number of whites. They greatly outnumbered whites in the South and West provinces, and included many slave-owning coffee planters. In the West Indies, free blacks and coloreds generally supported the slave regime, as had the freed slaves in Rome, some of whom became slave owners, and in the pre-modern world in general. In Saint-Domingue's North Province, many people of color had become indispensable as managers of sugar estates. As members of the militia and especially the rural police, they provided security forces that captured runaway slaves, kept the Maroons at bay, and preserved the colony's peace. A few of the free coloreds became quite wealthy. As a group, they owned at least 100,000 slaves. The elite free blacks and coloreds generally sent their children to France for education. Enough of them remained in France to form a significant community, symbolized by their Société des Colons Américains, the word American being reserved for colonists of mixed blood, as distinct from Europeans or Africans. Understandably, the free coloreds in Saint-Domingue deeply resented the indignities and discriminations that were part of white efforts to reduce them to the position of an undercaste. From their first organized protests in Saint-Domingue, freedmen demanded an equal right to participate in the system, so that wealth rather than race would be the criterion of status. Yet local laws, based on what the Jamaican Assembly termed the corruption of blood, tried to prohibit them from wearing European dress, from taking the title of Monsieur or Madame, from sitting with whites at meals, or in church and the theater, or from entering the professions and prestigious trades. Though many such restrictions were not strictly enforced, the free coloreds felt an increasing rage and resentment over institutional racism, along with a special hostility toward lower-class whites, who loved to flaunt their racial superiority over coloreds who were both wealthier and better educated than themselves. At the start of the French Revolution, free coloreds, especially in France, were greatly encouraged by the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the egalitarian rhetoric of 1789. A group of mulattoes led by Julien Raymond, a distinguished Parisian lawyer, appeared before the bar of the Constituent Assembly in October, petitioning to be seated as West Indian deputies. Their cause of racial equality became unintentionally fused with anti-slavery when they received strong support from the elite white Amis des Noirs. The Amis were quickly shouted down and accused of being tools of an English conspiracy to destroy the French colonies. American abolitionists would face similar accusations of being agents of England some 45 years later. The white pro-colonial faction was very strong in France and continued to outmaneuver the abolitionists. While some of the wealthy white colonial leaders saw political and social advantages in granting equality to free coloreds, they felt a compelling fear that concessions on the color line would lead to white rebellion in the West Indies, and then to the loss of the colonies. Yet as matters developed, it was precisely this issue of rights and representation for free coloreds that opened the way for slaves in Saint-Domingue to free themselves. At first, the Assembly toyed with the possibility of granting suffrage to all persons over 25 who owned a certain amount of property or paid taxes, thus co-opting wealthy mulattoes. Then, in 1790, one of the mulatto leaders in France, Vincent Auguet, received funds from British abolitionists before sailing to the United States, where he obtained arms. After finally landing in Saint-Domingue, he demanded elections and suffrage for all free males on the basis of existing French law. Auguet and his followers professed full support for the slave system, but they soon became involved in an armed rebellion, which French officials crushed. After fleeing eastward to Spanish Santo Domingo, Auguet was extradited, broken on a wheel, and killed. At this point, the French Assembly promised never to interfere with the status of persons, meaning persons of African descent, in the colonies. In the colonies, however, growing turmoil erupted in response to belated news from France. white communities dissolved into clashing factions of royalists, Jacobins, secessionists, and French officials. By the spring of 1791, the French Assembly was finally willing to hear testimony from mulattoes on the evils of racial discrimination. Julien Raymond now assured the delegates that only the free coloreds could keep the slaves subdued and avoid a destructive uprising. Yet, as part of the increasing radicalism of the Revolution, the radical Jacobin leader Maximilien Robespierre delivered a flaming oration intended to expose the national disgrace of officially sanctioning slavery. On May 15th, the Compromise Amendment timidly breached the color wall when the Assembly proclaimed, in highly legalistic and confusing language, that no law would be passed on the status of persons not free other than those born of free mothers and fathers. In other words, the Revolutionary Assembly tried to reassure planters that it would pass no law regarding slaves or even the descendants of slaves unless both parents of an individual had been free at the time of birth. It has often been assumed that the number of such people was small, but Julien Raymond claimed that the new law would apply to the vast majority of people of African descent. The decree sent to colonies was intended to reassure the whites, supposedly reaffirming the white colonists' autonomy in defining the status both of slaves and the majority of freed people, contrary to Raymond. Yet the Assembly had insisted that the children of two free parents, regardless of color, should enjoy the full rights of citizenship. This was exactly the kind of Trojan horse legislation that South Carolinians had sought to permanently prevent 4 years earlier in the American Constitutional Convention. And in 1791, white French colonists saw the decree as a betrayal of the Assembly's earlier promise never to interfere with the status of persons in the colonies. When some white colonists predicted that the measure would inevitably lead to slave emancipation, there was increasing talk of secession and an alliance with England. For the Western world, Saint-Domingue faced the crucial test of reform, of the possibility of elevating freedmen to the status of citizens without jeopardizing the richest plantation regime the world had yet seen. This was the stormy context in which slaves in Saint-Domingue's North Province rose in a well-planned and massive insurrection in August 1791, as the historian Laurent Dubois describes it. A troop of nearly 2,000 slaves went from plantation to plantation, killing whites, burning houses, and setting cane fields alight. Much of the northern plain was soon engulfed by the rebellion. The fire which they spread to the sugarcane, to all the buildings, to their houses, covered the sky with churning clouds of smoke during the day, and at night lit up the horizon with aurora borealis that projected far away the reflection of so many volcanoes, and gave all objects a livid tint of blood. News reached Britain, still at peace with revolutionary France, that over 100,000 French slaves had risen in revolt, and that hundreds of great plantation houses were now in ashes. Though most white colonists recognized their dependence on the support of the free colored population in suppressing the rebellious slaves, and though mulattoes agreed to an alliance with the wealthier whites, the outgoing Constituent Assembly in Paris panicked and backtracked once again, in part because of the long delay in receiving news. The Assembly now renounced jurisdiction over all race relations and over the status of persons in the colonies. When received, this news infuriated many mulattoes, who felt betrayed and who now launched their own war of racial vengeance. To further complicate matters, the beleaguered and outnumbered whites in the South Province armed their slaves to fight free mulattoes. And in Paris, on April 4, 1792, the new Legislative Assembly decreed full equal rights for all free blacks and mulattoes in the French colonies. This act, granting full racial equality as a matter of law, was one of the truly great achievements of the French Revolution, but it has seldom been noticed in history textbooks. With anarchy spreading in Saint-Domingue, the Legislative Assembly sent an army of some 6,000 troops, headed by 3 civil commissioners, to end civil war in the colony. The commissioners, especially Léger Félicité Sonthonac, a radical Jacobin, were deeply committed to the egalitarian ideology of the French Revolution. The military need to enlist more soldiers kept eroding racial barriers, especially after France declared war on England and Spain. But it is a mistake to think of all the colony's slaves united in a single revolt. Alliances kept shifting and differed dramatically from one local region to another. When the Spanish invaded Saint-Domingue from the east, Toussaint Louverture and some other future Haitian leaders fought on their side. Confusion increased even further in September 1793, when a large English expeditionary force landed from Jamaica. By April 1794, the British had gained temporary control not only of French Martinique, Guadeloupe, and St. Lucia, but of roughly one-third of Saint-Domingue. Meanwhile, when Santonat had in 1793 faced a pressing need to gain the military support of slaves against the Spanish and conservative French whites, he had moved from a limited to a more general emancipation proclamation. Then, on February 4, 1794, the French National Convention outlawed slavery in all the French colonies and guaranteed the rights of citizenship to all men regardless of color. Such a manifesto would have been inconceivable during the years of the Revolution, and it may have been instrumental in persuading Toussaint Louverture to abandon the Spanish, who were intent on preserving slavery, and to take a decisive leadership of the Republican Army. Sir Adam Williamson, the leader of the British forces, was confident that with the support of the free coloreds, he could easily conquer the colony and pacify the slaves. But such support, he informed London, would depend on his authority to abolish legal distinctions of color. In Britain, however, racial dogma took precedence over military strategy. Refugee French royalists and proprietors, along with British West India planters, convinced the British government that the color line was an indispensable foundation of the slave system. If equality of color were granted in Saint-Domingue, how could it be avoided in neighboring Jamaica? Accordingly, the official measures Britain adopted for governing the occupation of foreign West Indian colonies specified that all free coloreds would have the same status as the free coloreds in the British colonies. In Saint-Domingue, the affranchis, or freed slaves, refused to accept this provision in the capitulation agreements, and British commanders promised for a time to maintain equal rights. But by the summer of 1794, British policy had encouraged white racism as well as growing discrimination in the occupied zones. Some whites talked openly of exterminating the free coloreds or of deporting them to Botany Bay in Australia. Dismayed by this turn of events, the gens de couleur plotted rebellions and wavered uneasily between the British and French sides. Though Toussaint deeply mistrusted the gens de couleur, he succeeded in skillfully undermining their alliance with the British. Free coloreds throughout the West Indies had tried to keep their aspirations distinct from those of slaves, but events in Saint-Domingue suggested that demands for racial equality could provide slaves and freedmen with a common enemy and destroy the wealthiest slave regime in the Americas. For planters in other countries, it made little difference that the slaves had revolted well before the gens de couleur were granted equal rights, or that the British might well have subdued Saint-Domingue if they had reaffirmed this French policy and had mobilized the free colored forces. Most slaveholders simply believed that black slavery would be untenable if free blacks and coloreds were accorded equal status with whites. In the eyes of British leaders, Jacobin and abolitionist principles threatened by 1795 to subvert the entire West Indian world. In Saint-Domingue, Toussaint's ex-slaves had won brilliant victories and were closing in on Britain's disease-ridden troops. Armies of former slaves and free coloreds had expelled the British from Guadeloupe and St. Lucia. Racial warfare raged in Grenada and St. Vincent. French free-colored agents were blamed for inciting a Maroon War in Jamaica. By 1798, the British had lost nearly 35,000 soldiers and perhaps half that many sailors in the Caribbean. Edmund Burke wrote caustically of recruits to the West Indian grave and of fighting to conquer a cemetery. The British responded by recruiting their own slave troops with promises of eventual freedom, and sometimes enlisted Africans who had only recently disembarked from slave ships. In Saint-Domingue, thousands of blacks fought for the British, and thus for the maintenance of the slave regime until 1798, when some joined whites in the British evacuation to Jamaica. It is significant that Sir Adam Williamson defended the recruiting and freeing of male slaves on the ground that they would mostly die or re-enlist and would not add to the long-term growth of the freed population. David Geggus, in the most exhaustive study of the British occupation, concludes that British intervention weakened the gens de couleur, contributed to the growing power of the blacks, and helped to destroy the French slave regime the British were trying to preserve. The defeat of the Spanish, British, and eventually French armies is especially remarkable in view of the persistent division between blacks and mulattoes, which continued to dominate the long history of an independent Haiti. The distinction of color partially overlapped the distinction between the anciens libres, the people who owed their freedom to pre-revolutionary acts of manumission, and the nouveaux libres, or recently emancipated slaves. Color and the timing of freedom both symbolized the degree by which a person was removed from the degradation and humiliation of bondage. The anciens libres included large landholders who had owned slaves themselves. Their interests and outlook were often at odds with those of the black military elite associated with Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint did not win mastery of Saint-Domingue until he had crushed mulatto resistance and defeated the pro-French mulatto general André Rigaud. On the other hand, Toussaint himself was an ancien libre, who had owned land and at least one slave. He was also highly intelligent, a Catholic, and surprisingly well educated. His ex-slave lieutenants, Henri Christophe and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, made fortunes from Toussaint's reinstitution, without formal slavery, of the plantation system. Black and mulatto leaders shared a common interest in encouraging exports that could pay for the arms and supplies, mostly imported from the United States, needed for the island's defense. Their experiences with white oppression also gave them the sense of sharing a common African heritage. Although Toussaint was willing to acknowledge nominal French sovereignty, and even tried to induce refugee white planters to return to Saint-Domingue, he and his black and mulatto followers were determined to prevent the restoration of either slavery or the color line. Toussaint's Constitution of 1801 abolished slavery forever, prohibited distinctions according to color, and affirmed equal protection of the law, measures that were appended to the U.S. Constitution in compromised form only after the Civil War. General Charles Victor Emmanuel Leclerc, whom Napoleon dispatched early in 1802 with an initial force of some 16,000 troops to subjugate Saint-Domingue, knew he would have to pledge support for these high principles. Yet Napoleon, who expected that the forthcoming Treaty of Amiens would ensure at least the temporary pacification of Europe, had secretly resolved to restore colonial slavery, the African slave trade, and white supremacy, as part of the reconstruction of a new French colonial empire in the Caribbean and North America. Leclerc, who happened to be Napoleon's brother-in-law, hoped to deceive and divide the blacks and mulattoes while wooing their leaders, pacifying the countryside, and re-establishing French sovereignty. Leclerc was wholly unprepared for the skillful and heroic resistance he encountered, but the French succeeded after incredibly bloody warfare in enlisting the services of Christophe and Dessalines, promising them amnesty and a policy of freedom and racial equality. Christophe even entrusted his 9-year-old son to the French and provided funds for his education in France. The boy was thrown into an orphan asylum in Paris, where he died from neglect and want. Leclerc then succeeded in seizing Toussaint Louverture by a ruse, after first negotiating a deceptive surrender. After being shipped to France as Napoleon had ordered, Toussaint died in a freezing fortress high in the Jura Mountains. Still, Leclerc's army, now reinforced by over 30,000 men, could not subdue the black guerrillas in the hills. In the summer of 1802, when Napoleon's veterans were being decimated by yellow fever and malaria, news arrived that slavery had been restored in Guadeloupe. Leclerc complained in frantic letters to Napoleon and the Minister of Marine, really a Secretary of State, that the moral force I had obtained here is destroyed. I can do nothing by persuasion. Just when a political settlement seemed in sight, Leclerc wrote, His work was undermined by the revelation of French intentions and by the return from exile of planters and merchants who talked only of slavery and the slave trade. As blacks took up arms to defend their freedom, Leclerc reported to Napoleon that these men die with an incredible fanaticism. They laugh at death. It is the same with the women. Thousands of mulattoes joined the rebel forces when they learned that the French had re-established the color line in Guadeloupe. The defectors included Alexandre Pétion, a mulatto officer and future president of southern Haiti, who had fought Toussaint and had then joined Leclerc's expedition in France. In the fall of 1802, when Leclerc died of yellow fever while pleading to Napoleon for more troops, Christophe and Dessalines deserted the French. Leclerc's successor, General Rochambeau, then resorted to a policy of at least partial genocide. The French concluded that Saint-Domingue could be pacified only by exterminating most of the existing black and mulatto population, which could later be replaced by African slaves. The racial war of 1802-3 carried profound implications for every black and mulatto in the New World. Napoleon's reversal of French policy showed that a white nation could reinstitute slavery, strip the free descendants of slaves of their rights, and kill even children of the stigmatized race if their families had been contaminated with the ideas of liberty. The rebels' response showed that blacks and mulattoes could unite and defeat a professional European army. White commentators insisted that the army had really been defeated by disease and by the naval blockade the British imposed when war resumed in 1803. It was difficult to deny, however, that the blacks had won battles and knew how to make the most of the yellow fever and the British blockade. The blacks turned the entire white cosmos upside down when they forced the French to evacuate Saint-Domingue in late 1803, when Dessalines proclaimed the independence of Haiti on January 1, 1804, and then in 1805 ordered the massacre of most of the remaining whites. Every New World society was familiar with slave rebellions. Some maroon communities had resisted conquest for many decades and had even negotiated treaties, as in Jamaica, with colonial authorities. But no slaves in history had ever expelled their former masters and established their own nation-state. The very existence of Haiti challenged every slaveholding regime in the New World, and for that matter in the Cape Colony of South Africa and in the French and English colonies in the Indian Ocean. As the London Times put it, a black state in the Western Archipelago is utterly incompatible with the system of all European colonization. Hoping to allay white fears and ease the way for diplomatic recognition, Dessalines and his successors disavowed any interest in interfering with the domestic institutions of neighboring countries. Except for invading and annexing Spanish Santo Domingo, the eastern part of the island from which various enemies could threaten Haitian independence, Haiti posed no direct military danger to foreign slaveholders. Despite temporary panic over reports of Haitian agents inciting slaves in the Caribbean colonies and the southern United States, slave revolts were not as frequent after 1804 as in previous centuries. There is fragmentary evidence, however, that slaves in many localities were well aware of the Haitian Revolution and of the possibility of actually destroying the system to which they were violently subjected. Even in 1791, Jamaican slaves sang songs about the Saint-Domingue insurrection within a month after the uprising began. After the Great Barbadian Insurrection of 1816, which we will discuss in Chapter 11, and which resulted in the execution of over 200 blacks, some of the slave testimony pointed to Haiti as a model. Nanny Grigg, a literate house servant, who apparently concluded from news of the parliamentary debates over slave registration that Britain intended to emancipate colonial slaves on New Year's Day, 1816, urged her brethren to fight for the freedom their owners had withheld, and to set fires, as that was the way they did in St. Domingo. Whites also found evidence of the Dominican influence on slave revolts or conspiracies in such far-flung spots as Maracaibo in Venezuela, Cartagena in Colombia, and Puente Coupé in Spanish Louisiana. In view of Louisiana's heavy influx of white, free-colored, and slave refugees from Saint-Domingue, it seems almost certain that knowledge of the Revolution had spread among the hundreds of slaves who in 1811 rose in rebellion and marched to within 18 miles of New Orleans, before being defeated by an American militia. In this instance, Governor William Claiborne shrewdly enlisted as militiamen free-colored refugees who had recently fled from revolutionary destruction in the French colonies. Caribbean planters and government officials were accustomed to risk and expected Haitian-inspired subversion. They were also convinced that their fortunes or livelihood depended on a labor force that would soon die off unless replenished by continuous imports from Africa. The catastrophe in Saint-Domingue, they claimed, showed the dangers of abolitionist agitation, not of a labor supply on which the Caribbean colonies had always depended. Planters, therefore, did all they could to suppress information that might undermine the official doctrine that black slaves, unless aroused by outsiders, were helpless, degraded beings whose servitude was as natural as the force of gravity. It is therefore extremely difficult to assess the actual influence of the Haitian Revolution on the behavior of slaves and freed people. For example, the arrival in Virginia of a motley assortment of French colonists and their slaves may well have led to increasing white complaints about black insolence and unrecoverable runaway slaves. But little can be said with certainty about the sources of the great Gabriel slave conspiracy of 1800. Except that court testimony indicated that the insurgents planned to spare the lives of Frenchmen, and that the Virginia Argus opined that the insurrection had been organized on the true French plan. The Haitian inspiration was much clearer in Cuba, where in 1812 José Antonio Aponte and his rebel followers, including some whites, flew the Haitian colors and wore Haitian hats before being defeated, tortured, and put to death. Like Cuba, Jamaica simmered with rumors of conspiracy, as refugees streamed in from Saint-Domingue and as Jamaican slaves escaped to Haiti. In 1815, an assembly committee reported that young blacks had vowed to kill off the white population if they were not granted their freedom. As late as 1835, there were clear marks of Haitian influence when hundreds of Brazilian slaves and freedmen joined the Mala revolt in the city of Salvador, even though this major uprising was largely Muslim-inspired and took place during Ramadan. Although the Jamaican free-coloreds generally supported the slave system, they began by 1823 to address their appeals for civil rights to influential Englishmen, who were already calling for the gradual abolition of slavery. This reprise of Dominican events of 1789-93 alarmed Jamaican officials. Significantly, they arrested two colored merchants, Louis Lesesne and Edward Escoffery, whose white fathers had much earlier fled to Jamaica from Saint-Domingue. Lesesne and Escoffery were charged with arming and training slaves for a general insurrection, and both men were deported without a trial to Haiti. For white Jamaicans, this move proved to be counterproductive, since the blatant racial hysteria played into the hands of British reformers. In 1830, Lesesne and Escoffery were repatriated and financially compensated for their losses, a reversal that was part of Britain's general extension of civil liberties to the colonial free-colored. Denmark Vesey, the free black leader of the supposedly momentous 1822 slave conspiracy in Charleston, South Carolina, also discussed in Chapter 11, had worked as a slave in Saint-Domingue in the early 1780s. After winning an extraordinary $1,500 in a Charleston lottery and buying his freedom in 1800, Vesey took a lively interest in the Haitian Revolution. In the trials following the exposure of the alleged massive plot, one black testified that Vesey, also known as Telemaque, was in the habit of reading to me all the passages in the newspapers that related to Saint-Domingue, as well as every pamphlet he could lay his hands on that had any connection with slavery. Other slave testimony referred to letters to Haiti, requesting aid, and to one of Vesey's followers promising that St. Domingo and Africa would come over and cut up the white people if we only made the motion here first. The evidence suggested that VZ may have hoped to gain assistance from Haiti and the North, and to sail to Haiti after exterminating the whites and destroying Charleston. Henry William de Saussure, South Carolina's leading jurist, spoke of the rebels appealing to the Haitians as their natural allies. He predictably used the history of Haiti as an example of the destructive civil wars that would inevitably follow any move toward slave emancipation. While the Haitian example inspired a few violent conspiracies, it had a deeper and more enduring impact on the self-image and nascent national identity of free blacks, especially in the northern United States. From the outset, the Haitian Revolution stirred the free black community of Philadelphia, a port city long involved in West Indian commerce. What impressed a black leader like James Forten, a prosperous sailmaker and entrepreneur, was not the violence that could be attributed to war and to slavery itself. It was rather the providential message that the black people would become a great nation, and could not always be detained in their present bondage. By the 1820s, when blacks in various northern cities began celebrating the anniversary of Haitian independence, the revolution became a symbolic negation of everything slavery represented. As William Watkins, an African Methodist Episcopal minister in Baltimore, put it in 1825, Haiti had become an irrefutable argument to prove that the descendants of Africa never were designed by their Creator to sustain an inferiority, or even a mediocrity, in the chain of being, but they are as capable of intellectual improvement as Europeans, or any other nation upon the face of the earth. In his revolutionary Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, 1829, Boston's David Walker, a free black dealer in used clothes, urged his brethren to read the history of Haiti, which he termed the glory of the blacks and terror of tyrants. A decade earlier, Robert Wedderburn, a Jamaican mulatto who had emigrated to London, merged the cause of blacks with the cause of Britain's working class. A member of Thomas Spence's circle of ultra-radicals, Wedderburn appealed to the precedent of Haiti when he called on West Indian blacks to slay man, woman, and child, and exhorted English wage slaves to revolt against their oppressors. Yet as a model of liberation, the Haitian Revolution suffered from inherent liabilities. One clue to this no-win dilemma can be seen in the white response to the freed slaves' military performance. In popular imagery, the blacks were either cowards or fiends, excited barbarians who panicked when hard-pressed, or demons capable of unthinkable atrocities. Though Wordsworth paid famous tribute to Toussaint Louverture in 1802, "There's not a breathing of the common wind that will forget thee. Thou hast great allies." Toussaint's sudden capitulation in 1802 evoked some scorn for the blacks and confident reassurances that in normal circumstances white discipline could always overcome, as young Henry Brougham put it, the vast numbers and ferocious strength of a savage people. Racial stereotypes of savagery reinforced the fear and contempt that slaves had always aroused among non-slaves. When the French were finally defeated, even abolitionists found it difficult to acknowledge that the degraded blacks of Saint-Domingue had vindicated their honor in a way comparable to the American patriots of 1776, or the patriots of the later Latin American or Greek struggles for independence. It is true that in the late 1790s, American Federalists became so fearful of the infidel French that they not only praised Toussaint, but the Adams administration provided his army with indispensable supplies and even naval support. After Britain resumed war against Napoleon in 1803, various writers tried to portray the Haitians as heroic allies in a common struggle for freedom. Toussaint, once he had perished in Napoleon's prison, became a legitimate martyr and even a man of honor, largely because he could serve as a foil to Napoleon as the treacherous enslaver of nations. But since Britain had a compelling self-interest to protect Haitian independence, what seems really striking is the relative absence of popular sympathy for the Haitians as a people when compared, let us say, to Napoleon's continental subjects or to the Greeks in their later War of Independence. The enduring memory of the Haitian Revolution was not simply the isolated Toussaint as a tragic hero, but also Dessalines, the butcher of whites. For an age obsessed with the problem of freedom and order, the Haitian Revolution suggested the unleashing of pure id. Haiti faced a similar double check in the field of political economy. When black leaders, beginning with Toussaint, sought to revive the export economy by resorting to the forced labor on the plantations, they were accused of reinstituting slavery. When they accommodated the peasants' desires for small plots of land and acquiesced in a sharp decline in exports and the dominance of subsistence farming and local markets, the world perceived Haiti as regressing to savagery. The seeming alternatives of regimented labor or tropical indolence were hailed by pro-slavery writers as proof of two irrepressible truths: that blacks would not work unless coerced, and that in tropical climates slavery was indispensable for progress. Few commentators question the desirability of the plantation system itself. British abolitionists were eager to celebrate Haiti's material and moral progress as proof of the blacks' capability for freedom and civilization. The very fact that the new nation could be burdened with such momentous expectations meant that the issue of capability was in doubt, that the Haitians' friends had put them before the bench of world opinion as the defendants of their race. It would have been alien to the age, however, to propose economic aid for a region devastated by 13 years of civil war. Indeed, beginning with Jefferson's presidency, the United States quarantined Haiti as a potential source of racial subversion. England postponed even partial recognition of Haitian independence until 1825, when France finally gave up hope of reconquering the rebellious colony. Even after Napoleon's fall, Haiti's leaders faced a genuine danger of French invasion or less direct forms of conquest. In 1825, Haiti's president, Jean-Pierre Boyer, finally won French recognition only by agreeing to a staggering indemnity of 150 million francs, and to reduced customs charges for French ships, concessions that made the Republic fatally dependent on foreign credit and foreign economic control. During the first third of the 19th century, Haiti stood as the single decisive example of mass emancipation. Britain had established a small colony of freed blacks at Sierra Leone, which helped to inspire the later American settlement of Liberia. But it was difficult to extrapolate any general principles from these faltering experiments. The seaboard states from New Jersey to New Hampshire might have presented more suitable laboratories if the freed people had not confronted immense white majorities and an enveloping racism that deprived them of the most elemental rights and opportunities, beginning with good schools. Abolitionists in both England and America made remarkably few references to the Northern States Emancipation Acts and their consequences. For a time, however, abolitionists did pin their hopes on Haiti. In most respects, the very existence of Haiti was a godsend for the abolitionists' opponents. Sanguine predictions of the moral and educational advance of the people, of economic enterprise that would soon lead to thriving towns and to Haitian ships entering the harbors of the world, increasingly gave way to reports of political upheaval and hopeless poverty. The tacit comparison with the fruits of North American independence locked the abolitionists into a defensive posture. It became necessary to explain why Henri Christophe's Anglophilic Northern Kingdom collapsed, why President Boyer imposed a draconian labor law, why exports plummeted, why the economy stagnated, why the mulattoes and blacks contested for power, why the Haitians should be compared to the British barbarians of Roman times, as some apologists argued, rather than to people who had benefited from centuries of progress. While it is impossible to measure public opinion on such matters, the negative images of Haiti, hardly ever accompanied by historical analyses and explanations, probably reinforce the conviction, especially among American whites, that free blacks were incapable of governing themselves in a civilized state. As we have already seen, however, the Haitian Revolution conveyed a different message to free blacks and to a few white abolitionists. For them, it was not simply a matter of black power and capability, though the ex-slaves' creation and governance of an independent nation, however poor and unstable, clearly contradicted the worst stereotypes of black inferiority. The birth of Haiti was also an unprecedented and unforeseen historical event, a revelation of God's will and a harbinger of universal emancipation. Pompée Valentin Vasty, Henri Christophe's publicist and advisor, wrote of a global liberation in which 500 million men, black, yellow, and brown, would reclaim their natural rights and privileges. The Constitution of Alexandre Pétion's Southern Republic in Haiti invited the black and colored populations of other New World countries to a kind of aliyah, the immigration of Jews to Israel, that would in effect convert Haiti into a black Israel. In the 1820s, President Boyer's appeal for African American immigrants stirred the free black communities of the Northern American states. Although thousands who emigrated to Haiti became quickly disillusioned and many returned to the United States, Haiti remained a symbol of hope and a historical reassurance, long embedded in African American consciousness. As Fredrick Douglass proclaimed in 1893, Haiti proved that human bondage was not an inevitable or eternal fate.
Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.